Hi, friends. It's your girl Harpo. Welcome to this episode of Brown Girl Guild titled The Women That Become Our Mothers. Disclaimer: I might get senti in this podcast episode. Disclaimer: you might get senti in this podcast episode. And if you send this episode to your mom or she's listening to it with you in the car or at home, Auntie G, you might also get senti with this episode. This episode I have been actually avoiding and really staying away from, if I'm going to be very honest, because I know I'm going to get senti. It's going to be a senti episode. But it's important. It's an important story. It's an important, intention. And the world needs to hear it. I need to hear it. I need to say it. I need to share it. And so here goes. If I'm stumbling, if I'm not making sense, I'm just going to be transparent with you. It's because it's kind of like senti, okay? It's senti. That's the theme. That's the vibe. That could have been the title of this episode. So this episode is about a story that's related to my mom. And it's the story of how my mom came to Canada. And it's a funny story. So it's not a hard story. It's not a traumatic story. I mean, like, actually, in hindsight, we could kind of see it as traumatic, but it's a funny story. So I'm going to start off with the story. So for many years in my family, this story is notorious, right? Like, we've all heard this story. We all have our own versions of this story now because we've heard it so many times and we've told it to other people so many times. And I've heard this story multiple times growing up. But the reason that this episode is titled The Women That Become Our Mothers is because the last time that I heard this story at home, something clicked for me, something shifted, and I realized something very, very profound the last time I heard this story. So here's the story. My mom got married when she was 18, and shortly after she came to Canada. My dad married my mother and he moved back to Canada. And so my mom sort of just waited until she heard the news about, when she was going to come to Canada. Eventually that happened, right? She got the call, she got the green light to move to Canada. And so she was super excited. She packed up her entire life, packed up all her bags, and sort of left, right? And she was going to go to a country where she really only knew one person really well, which was my dad. And she'd only really met him a year ago. And so she, packed up her entire life and just trusted that when she gets to this country, she's going to be taken care of, she's going to be happy, she's going to be fine. And for the most part, that's exactly how her life has turned out. She married a really nice guy and, she has amazing children. But when she journeyed from India to Canada, she journeyed in a way that we just have not been able to let go of. And so imagine this. My mom packs up her entire life, drives from Punjab to Delhi, gets on a plane, and that plane ride is about 16 hours to Canada with a layover in between in probably a Western country like Germany at the Frankfurt airport. And so she comes all the way to Canada. And my dad and his family go to receive her. And you would imagine their surprise and their shock when they see this 18-year-old girl, who's just come from Punjab to Canada for the first time. She's sort of pushing this trolley full of detchis, this trolley full of suitcases down the ramp at YVR at the international's arrival section. And you would imagine their shock and dismay and their surprise when they see this 18-year-old wearing a lenga. So my mom came all the way from India to Canada wearing a lenga, right? Like, not just like a simple lenga, like a full-on body katia lenga, right? Like really fully embroidered lenga. And so for the longest time, this has been like a funny story in my family. Me and my brother love to tell our friends about it. My dad likes to tell it. My mom likes to tell it. It's a funny story. And for years, that's all it was, right? It was just a story about how my mom came from India to Canada. And like I said, the last time that I heard this story, something changed, something clicked, and I just heard the story in a way. Maybe I had a different awareness of it. Maybe I was in a different place, but I just heard this story and immediately I was shocked. I feel like I just sort of, like I froze and something clicked for me. And it was like, wow, the woman that came from India to Canada in a lenga is the woman that became my mom. And so the title of this episode is The Women That Become Our Mothers. And I really want to talk about and give space to the woman that became my mother. And I'm going to be incredibly transparent and say that, it wasn't even the woman that became my mother, it was the little girl that became my mother, right? Because at 18, that's what you are. You're still a baby. Like I'm 25 and I feel like a baby, but at 18, you're really a baby. Like what do you know at 18? What do you know about yourself, about other people, about the world at 18? And so in that moment, the last time that I heard this story, I just thought to myself, wow, the little girl that came to Canada in a lehenga is the woman that became my mother. And I asked my mom, I said, Mom, did nobody tell you that like you're not supposed to wear a lehenga to your flight to Canada? And she said, no, nobody told me. Nobody told me that, I can wear comfortable clothes. Just nobody told me. I said, "Did you not know that it was going to be uncomfortable to wear a lehenga on this plane?" She said, "No, nobody told me that it was going to be that long of a flight. And nobody told me that there was going to be a layover and this and that." And so I said to her, "So you had no expectation, like you had no actual understanding of like what that journey from, India to Canada was going to be like?" And I even asked my dad, I said, "Did you not tell your wife who was going to come to Canada? You'd made that journey a couple times by then. Did you guys not fill her in?" I think everybody just assumed that she would know. And I remember even asking my mom, like, "Did your mom not tell you? Like, did your parents not tell you that, like, did they not prepare you?" And so I couldn't get over how naive, my mother had been when she put that lehenga on and, you know, came all the way from India to Canada. I couldn't get over the naivety, however you say it. I couldn't get over how naive she was. I think that was what really struck me. Like that was the thing that I just couldn't get like I couldn't get over it. Right? I couldn't shake it off for days and days. I just kept thinking about how naive my mother was to have worn a lehenga. And you think about it, like if you really sit here you know, in this decade and think about what that looked like. In the 90s it was ridiculous, but even now it's ridiculous, right? With all the strides that we've made and being able to wear mendi and bindis out in the real world. But, in the 90s, like to really think about how like ridiculous that might have been, but to feel so naive to not even know that that wasn't socially appropriate or acceptable at the time, I just couldn't get over the naivety. And the secondary emotion that really, really I was like super anchored in and couldn't bring myself to get out of was guilt, was the brown girl guilt. Because for so long I had been so hard on my mom, right? Like I had been so hard on her and had held her to such high standards and just expected her to just know how to have been my mother. In the first episode of Brown Girl Guilt ever, it was a conversation with my mom. And, I told my mom in that moment that, like, you'd made a lot of mistakes and it's been really hard for me to forgive you. And while, yes, there's still a space for that and a place for that, I feel like when it clicked in my head that the 18-year-old little girl who wore a lehenga to Canada in the plane was the girl and the woman that became my mother, a lot of those mistakes felt a lot easier for me to forgive in that moment. And a lot of the guilt when I start to think about and really picture this 18-year-old girl in my mind in a lehenga, a lot of the guilt slowly started to dissipate. And I really started seeing my mom as a woman, right? As a human being and not just a mom who made mistakes raising Harpo. And again, that's a stark contrast to the previous episode where, I was super hyper focused on the shortcomings of my mother, which, is a stark contrast to how I have really cemented my relationship with my mom in the last few years, where it's always been about the mistakes. It's always been about what wasn't enough, you know? But I think what I'm learning, even from, really, really hyper focusing on this 18-year-old version of my mom, is that I have to see people in their totality. I have to see my mother in her totality 2 or 3 years ago, I added an image of my mom from her wedding onto something that I have in my room. It's called the Wall of Love. It's two shelves with a bunch of pictures that I framed and a bunch of quotes that I framed. And I edited an image of my mom from her wedding onto that wall of love. And, at the time, I feel like I did it just because I liked that picture of my mom. I thought she looked really pretty in her wedding lehenga. And it was a monumental moment in her life. And so I just thought at that time, oh, I'm just framing this and putting this in my room because I think she looks pretty in it. But very recently, I had a realization, and it was shortly after I had heard, the story of my mom coming to Canada in a lehenga the last time. After that profound shift and being able to see my mom as a human being, as a woman, and not just my mother. I went to the Yoko Ono exhibit at the Vancouver Art Gallery. And when I went into the Yoko Ono exhibit, there was a section, Yoko Ono is an artist. There was a section, and it was a room full of white sticky notes. And Yoko Ono had asked folks to write down something about their mom on a sticky note and put it on the wall. And so I kind of looked around at people's sticky notes, right? Some people had written things about their mom that they didn't like. Some people had written that their mom was the best mom in the world. Some people had even gotten their mom to write, something in their like native language, whether that was in Punjabi, in Gurmukhi, or like another Asian language. And so there were so many sticky notes representing mothers and motherhood and, this relationship between mother and child all around the room. And so I thought to myself, what would I write down on this sticky note about my mom that I could leave in this exhibit and sort of put out into existence into the world? So on my sticky note, I wrote down the morning of January 6, 1995. And the reason I wrote down January 6, 1995, and specifically the morning, is because that is the day that my mom and dad got married. And that was the probably the last time, the morning of January 6, 1995, was probably the last time that my mom, you know, was that version of herself. It was the last time before the world happened to her, before the real world happened to her. And since the morning of January 6, 1995, so much has happened to my mother and for my mother, right? Immigration has happened, motherhood. My mom also went through many miscarriages. She's had ups and downs with her mental health. She's had joy. She's had life. She's had love. She's also had the loss of both her parents. And so, since the morning of January 6, 1995, my mother has been a very, very different human being. She's been a very different woman. She's been a very, very different girl. And I think that is also why I have that picture of my mom from her wedding on the wall in my room, because that is a container, right? That is a world of stories. It's a world of expression and just a world of so much beauty that I feel like I've never really sat down and tapped into. And I might not ever have the chance to be able to really listen to and feel what that version of my mom really was, because perhaps that version of her has gotten lost somewhere along the way, and we might not be able to find her again. And I feel like I really haven't been able to sit down and ask her her stories, ask her her experiences. My therapist tells me all the time, you need to see your mother as a real human person, like as a human being that is separate from her relationship to you and her relationality and her positionality in your life. You have to be able to see her separately. And she sort of told me that is kind of the key to unlocking any of the friction or the resistance that I may have in my relationship with my mother. And yet it's still so hard to do. Like, I'm recording this episode and, I'm thinking to myself, like, oh my God, my mom might hear this. And even that I'm like feeling really, really vulnerable about. But it's still so hard to sit down with my mom and ask her about her stories, about her experiences. And I just keep wondering why. Is it because I'm afraid of what I'm going to hear? Is it going to be too much for me to carry? Is it going to be too much for me to hear? And is it going to be too painful for me to realize that version of my mother, right? That version of this beautiful woman, this incredible human being who has gone through many trials and tribulations aren't there anymore. And am I going to feel guilty for not being able to give her more, right? To be able to really hold her and create space for her and give that part of her meaning, right? Am I going to feel guilty for how I'm not able to give my mother the entire world after the world has taken so much from her? And so I don't have the answer for how I'm supposed to sit down with her and how I'm supposed to start. Normally when I'm recording an episode or I'm sharing, there's something that I give, right? But I think at this point, I'm just going to be very transparent and honest and say that I'm still pondering, right? I'm still curious and I'm still exploring what that looks like because I want to know how I can move forward and keep the legacy of my mother alive. How, as a community, as a sisterhood, as just a group of people, we can move forward and keep the legacies of our mothers alive, and how we can hold space also for the women that became our mothers while we're consistently and committed to holding space for ourselves and for the women that we're going to become. I'm really, really curious to know how I can keep that version and the spirit and the expression of the woman that was my mother on the morning of January 6, 1995, alive.